The grand concert hall. The night was cool. The city streets were alive with the soft hum of cars and the sound of footsteps on the pavement. Outside the grand concert hall, people gathered in small groups, their voices mixing with laughter, and the occasional sound of a camera clicking. The building stood tall, glowing under the streetlights, its glass doors reflecting the bright chandeliers inside. Men wore sharp suits and polished shoes. Women wore long dresses and jewelry that caught the light. The air was filled with the scent of expensive perfume. Everyone looked like they belonged here, except for one boy standing near the far end of the steps. His jacket was too big for him, the sleeves almost covering his hands. His shoes were worn and scuffed, yet his eyes held a light that outshone the gold of the hall. The boy didn't move toward the entrance. Instead, he stood still, looking at the posters framed in glass along the wall. The posters showed the smiling face of the famous pianist everyone had come to see. The man's hands were resting gently on the keys of a grand piano in the picture. The words underneath praised his unmatched talent and years of global success. The boy read them slowly, almost as if tasting each word. Inside the hall, the seats were slowly filling up. Red velvet cushions, stretched out in perfect rows. The stage sat in the center. A single grand piano, waiting under the glow of warm stage lights. The wood of the instrument shone like a dark mirror, its curves smooth and inviting. People were already leaning toward each other, whispering about the performance that was about to start. A gentle murmur swept through the audience as the famous pianist appeared at the side of the stage. He was tall, neatly combed hair and a black suit that fit perfectly. He moved with the calm confidence of someone used to the spotlight. A small smile played on his lips as he looked over the crowd. He gave a polite nod before stepping back. Letting the stage crew finish their preparations near the back, the boy finally stepped inside. The ticket checker gave him a quick glance. His ticket looked old, folded so many times it had begun to tear. Still, the checker waved him through. The boy walked slowly down the aisle, his steps soft on the carpet, his eyes taking in every detail. The gold patterns on the walls, the crystal lights above, the way the grand piano seemed to wait like a sleeping giant. He took a seat close to the corner, far from the center where the wealthy guests sat. From here, he could see the pianist moving behind the curtains, talking with someone and adjusting his cufflinks. The boy's fingers twitched slightly, as if they wanted to press invisible keys in the air. He leaned forward, his gaze never leaving the piano. The sound of the hall changed as the lights dimmed. Conversations faded into silence. The stage lights grew brighter, focusing on the piano in the middle. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Even the boy felt it, his chest rising and falling faster. He could almost hear the music before it started, but as he sat there, something inside him stirred. It wasn't just excitement for the performance. It was something else, a quiet yearning. A small voice in his heart whispering that maybe, just maybe, he belonged up there too, playing under the same lights, making the same kind of music that could silence a crowd. The doors at the back of the hall closed with a soft thud, trapping the night air outside. Inside, the warmth of the room wrapped around the audience. The stage glowed like a world of its own. The pianist walked onto the stage with long, confident steps. The audience clapped politely. The boy clapped too, but his eyes stayed fixed on the man's hands, watching every small movement. The pianist bowed, his smile widening as the applause grew louder. Then, as he straightened, his gaze swept over the room. And for a brief moment, his eyes landed on the boy. There was something in that look, a flicker of curiosity, followed by a faint smirk. It was gone in a second, but the boy felt it. A strange heat rising in his chest. The pianist sat down at the piano, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. The audience leaned in, waiting for the first note. The boy's hands tightened into fists on his lap, not out of anger, but out of the deep pull he felt toward that instrument. He didn't know it yet. But this night would be the start of something no one in that hall could have imagined. And as the music began to fill the room, weaving through every corner and every heart, the boy listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole soul. The grand concert hall had never felt so big, and yet in that moment it felt like it was. Holding only him and the music, the first insult, the first song ended with a gentle flourish. the pianist's hands lifting from the keys like a bird taking flight. The audience clapped warmly, some even standing for a moment before sitting back down. The hall was filled with the soft shuffle of programs and the whisper of conversation. The famous pianist gave a small bow, his smile fixed as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He stood and walked to the edge of the stage, speaking into the microphone with a smooth, confident voice. He thanked the audience for coming, told them how much he enjoyed playing for such a fine crowd. Then his eyes landed again on the boy. Sitting far in the corner, his gaze lingered just a little too long. Sly glint in his eye. "Well now," he said, his tone light but sharp. "We have all kinds of guests tonight even, those who look like they wandered in from the street." A few people in the audience chuckled quietly. The boy's shoulders tensed. He looked down at his hands. The pianist tilted his head slightly, as if studying him from a distance. "I hope you didn't get lost, young man." The words were meant to sound like a joke, but they carried a sting, the kind that makes laughter feel heavier than silence. Some people laughed out loud. Others looked away uncomfortably. The boy didn't answer. He just shifted in his seat, wishing the lights weren't so bright. The pianist smoothed his jacket and added, "Unless, of course, you came to tune the piano for me." The laughter grew, this time louder. The boy's chest tightened, not because he was angry, but because the words pressed against something deep inside, a memory of other times he had been looked at that way, judged before anyone knew what he could do. The host, sensing a chance to keep the crowd amused, stepped up onto the stage and played along. "Well," he said with a grin, "maybe we should let him play a note or two, see if he's got any hidden talent." The audience murmured, half in jest, half curious. The boy's heart began to pound. He could feel every beat in his fingertips. He knew this wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge wrapped in a joke, a way to make him stumble in front of strangers. But he also knew something else, something the pianist didn't know, something no one in the hall could have guessed. The pianist leaned against the piano, clearly amused by the idea. "Go on then," he said, gesturing toward the stage with a sweep of his hand. "Play us something, if you dare." His voice carried that mix of charm and condescension only someone used to admiration could pull off. For a moment, the boy thought about shaking his head, staying in his seat, letting the moment pass. It would be easier, safer. But then another thought rose inside him, clear and strong. It told him that if he walked away now, he would carry this moment forever. Not as a memory, but as a regret. He stood slowly, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. The sound of his movement seemed to echo louder than it should have. The audience turned to watch, whispers traveling through the room like wind over grass. He walked toward the stage, each step steady but deliberate. The stage lights grew brighter as he approached, casting his shadow long and thin across the floor. The pianist stepped aside, folding his arms, a smile still on his face. "Careful now," he said softly. "This piano is worth more than your—" "Well, never mind." The words hung in the air like a dare. The boy didn't answer. He climbed the 2 small steps onto the stage, his eyes on the piano, not on the man beside it. He had never touched an instrument so beautiful. The wood shone. Under the light, the keys gleamed. The faint smell of polished wood rose with each step closer. He reached the bench and sat down, adjusting himself so his feet could touch the pedals. The crowd was restless, some leaning forward with interest, others ready to laugh. The boy placed his fingers gently on the keys, the surface cool and smooth under his skin. For a moment, he closed his eyes, blocking out the lights, the murmurs, the smirk from the man beside him when he opened them. His gaze was calm, steady, the same way a diver looks at the still surface of water before taking the plunge. His fingers pressed down on the first keys. The sound was soft, almost shy, but there was something in it, a hint of something, that made a few people stop shifting in their seats. The pianist, standing just behind him, tilted his head, perhaps expecting a clumsy mistake. The boy's hands moved again, a few more notes, gentle but connected, like words forming into a sentence. There was a pause, then his fingers began to move faster, the notes rising like a voice learning to speak. And in that moment, before the music truly began, there was a shift in the room, subtle but real, as if the audience sensed they were about to see something they did not expect. something that might change the way they looked at the boy entirely. A chance to prove himself for a few seconds. The boy's soft notes floated into the air like whispers. The crowd still carried traces of amusement in their faces, but their laughter had faded. The pianist, standing with his arms crossed, seemed relaxed, as though certain the boy would stumble at any moment. The boy's fingers paused for a breath. It was the kind of pause a seasoned musician makes, not because he has lost his way, but because he knows the power of silence. Then, with a slow inhale, he began again, his left hand grounding the music in deep, warm tones, his right hand painting delicate patterns over the top. The first real melody bloomed. It was simple, almost too simple, but there was something in the way it was played, a softness that drew the ear closer, a sincerity that made the listener lean in without realizing. The crowd shifted, no longer restless. From the corner of his eye, the boy could see the gleaming curve of the piano lid, its reflection showing the stage lights like small stars. He focused on the keys, letting his hands follow the memory of every night he had practiced alone in a cold garage. The cracked wood beneath his fingers back then had never sounded like this. But the feeling was the same. The host, standing off to the side, tilted his head, his smile fading into something else's: interest, curiosity. The pianist adjusted his stance, one eyebrow lifting ever so slightly. The boy's music grew more confident, his fingers weaving between the black and white keys as if they had always belonged there. The melody began to swell, the gentle rise turning into a wave of sound. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind that pressed gently but firmly on the chest. Rows of faces in the audience softened. A woman in the front row stopped fanning herself and lowered her hands into her lap. A man in a gray suit leaned forward, forgetting the drink in his hand. Somewhere near the middle, a young girl rested her chin on her hands, eyes wide. The boy's mind drifted for a moment, not away from the music, but deeper into it. He remembered the first time he had ever touched a piano. It was in a dusty old music shop. The owner had chased him away after only a minute, but that minute had been enough to set something alight inside him. From then on, every chance he got, he would sneak into places just to listen, to watch, to learn. Now, here he was, on a stage he had never dreamed of stepping onto, in front of people who hadn't expected him to be anything more than a quick joke. The thought should have made him nervous, but instead it fed the fire in his chest. The melody shifted again, this time carrying a playful twist. His fingers danced lightly over the keys, teasing the audience with brief moments of silence before rushing back into sound. A few people smiled without realizing. Others exchanged glances, as if to ask, "Who is this boy, and how is he playing like that?" The pianist's smirk was gone now, his arms unfolded, his eyes sharp and focused on the boy's hands. It wasn't anger yet, but it was something close, a recognition that this performance was no accident. The boy's right hand struck a quick run of notes, sharp and clean, followed by a rolling pattern in his left. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. The audience's breathing slowed. The stage lights seemed warmer. The boy could feel the pulse of the music matching the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Then came the moment, the part of the song where everything opened wide, his hands moving faster now, the melody soaring. It wasn't perfect. A note or two caught the wrong edge, but no one seemed to care. Mistakes only made it feel more alive. A single, low note rang out, holding steady, while his other hand layered soft chords above it. The sound wrapped around the room like a story reaching its peak. People in the back row sat straighter, their eyes drawn to the boy, as if the piano itself had pulled them forward. The boy didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel the change in the room. He could sense the shift from doubt to something else, something closer to respect. The pianist's gaze was fixed now, and though his face was still calm, there was a tension in his jaw. The boy let the song begin to slow, guiding it gently, downward like the last steps of a long walk. Each note was softer, warmer, until the final chord rested in the air, fading slowly into silence. For a breath, no one moved, no one clapped. It was as if they were afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Then a single pair of hands began to clap, followed by another. Then the sound grew until the whole hall was filled with applause. The boy sat still for a moment, his chest rising and falling. Then he stood, giving a small, awkward nod. The pianist's eyes followed him closely, unreadable. The boy stepped back from the piano, knowing something had just changed, not only for the audience, but for himself. This had been more than a joke, more than a dare. It had been a chance, and he had taken it. He didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time he felt certain of one thing: he belonged here. The applause faded slowly, like waves retreating from the shore. The boy stepped back from the piano bench, but his eyes lingered on the keys as if part of him didn't want to leave. The stage lights still glowed warmly, casting his shadow long across the polished floor. The host walked up, smiling in surprise. "Well," he said into the microphone. That was unexpected. His voice carried both curiosity and respect. The audience chuckled softly, but it was not the same laughter as before. This time it was warmer, almost proud. The famous pianist stepped forward, clapping politely, his smile fixed. "In place? Not bad," he said, the words smooth but measured. "But anyone can play one piece well if they practice it enough." The tone was casual, but there was an edge under it, a reminder that this was still his stage. The boy said nothing. He simply looked at the piano again, the urge to sit back down was strong. It was as if the instrument itself was calling to him. The host, sensing the tension, glanced between them. "Shall we let him play one more?" he asked the crowd. A few voices in the audience shouted yes. Others clapped in agreement. The pianist tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just a bit. "All right," he said at last. "Play something. Anything you want." His voice carried the challenge clearly this time. The boy moved slowly back to the bench. The wood creaked faintly as he sat down. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment, then rested gently. He closed his eyes, blocking out the lights, the audience, even the man standing behind him. In his mind, he was back in the quiet garage, sitting at the old broken piano, the cold air biting at his fingers. Then he began. The first notes were low and deep, rolling out like distant thunder. The sound filled the room in a way that made people sit straighter. The melody rose from those deep notes like a bird taking flight, smooth and graceful, but with a strength beneath it. The pianist's expression shifted ever so slightly. He knew this was no beginner's trick. This was control of tempo, of tone, of emotion. The boy's fingers moved in patterns that seemed both simple and impossibly complex. His left hand kept the steady heartbeat of the song, while his right hand wove delicate threads of melody through the air. Each note seemed to touch something in the listeners. The woman in the front row leaned forward, her hand resting against her mouth. A man in the upper balcony shook his head slowly, a small smile appearing. The audience was silent now, except for the music. The song told a story without words. It was the story of someone who had been overlooked, pushed aside, but who refused to fade. It was the sound of quiet nights and stubborn hope, of dreams no one else could see, and it was being told through every single note. The boy wasn't thinking about impressing anyone anymore. He wasn't thinking about the challenge, or the insult, or even the crowd. He was just playing, letting the music carry everything he had felt, everything he had lived, out into the open as the song built. The notes became sharper, faster, his fingers flying over the keys with a speed that drew small gasps from the audience. Yet there was no rush, no panic. Every movement was precise, controlled. The pianist's arms had dropped to his sides now. His eyes locked on the boy's hands, the smirk long gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. The host stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his microphone forgotten. The boy reached the peak of the piece, the notes climbing higher and higher until they seemed to spill over the edges of the piano, and then, with a sudden gentleness, the music began to fall, each note softer than the last, like raindrops fading after a storm. By the time the final note rang out, the hall was so silent that the sound seemed to echo. The boy's hands rested on the keys for a moment, before he slowly pulled them away. his chest rising and falling with deep breaths for a long heartbeat. No one moved. Then the clapping began, not hesitant, not polite, but loud and sure, rising quickly until it became a roar of applause. People stood from their seats, some shouting bravo, others simply clapping as hard as they could. The boy looked down, his face calm, though inside he felt something warm spreading through him. It's not pride exactly, but relief that the music had been heard, truly heard. The pianist stepped forward, his face unreadable. He placed a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "Interesting," he said softly. "Just for him to hear. Very interesting." Then he turned back to the crowd with his usual grace, but there was a tightness in his movements now, a shadow behind his practiced smile. The boy left the bench and walked toward the side of the stage, the applause following him like a wave. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a stranger in a place where he didn't belong. He felt like a musician walking away from his piano, and deep down, he knew something had shifted, not just in the audience's eyes, but in the mind of the man who had mocked him. The first notes he had played tonight had changed everything, and nothing would be the same after this. The transformation of the room, the applause still echoed in the grand hall, but the feeling inside the room had shifted entirely. It was no longer the polished atmosphere of a formal concert, where people clapped because they were expected to. Now it felt alive, charged with something real. People looked at the boy in a way they hadn't before. When he had walked in, they saw an outsider, someone who didn't belong. Now they saw a musician, someone who had spoken to them without saying a single word. The boy stepped off the stage slowly, the bright lights fading behind him. But the warmth from the audience seemed to follow. Their claps became softer, but the eyes that met his were filled with a mix of surprise, admiration, and something else, respect. Near the back wall, a group of older guests whispered to each other. One of them shook his head and said, "That wasn't luck, that was real skill." In another corner, a young couple smiled, the woman saying quietly, "He made me feel like I was in another world." The host took the stage again, his smile wider than before. He didn't need to tell the audience what had just happened. They already knew. Instead, he simply said, "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the most unexpected moments are the ones we remember forever." His words were met with another round of applause. The famous pianist stayed near the piano, his hand resting lightly on the lid, his expression calm, but his eyes followed the boy, something unreadable in them. Earlier, he had looked at him like a curiosity. Now, there was a weight in his gaze, as if he were trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The boy found his seat again, but it didn't feel the same. He wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. People nearby turned to him, some giving him small nods, others whispering things like "well done," and "that was beautiful." He answered only with a shy smile, his hands still tingling from the keys. When the pianist began his next piece, the room listened. But it wasn't the same kind of listening. As before, earlier, every note he played was received with automatic admiration. Now, there was a quiet comparison happening in the minds of the audience. It wasn't about skill, both were talented, but about heart, about who had made them feel more. The pianist played flawlessly, each note precise, the kind of performance that had earned him his fame. Yet here and there, the boy noticed something. It was perfect, but it felt distant, like a painting behind glass, beautiful but untouchable. Some in the crowd began to notice too, their eyes wandering back to the boy between movements, as if they were wondering how someone with no name, no training, could make them feel. What the world's top pianist had not. The boy wasn't thinking about any of that, though he was watching closely, studying the man's posture, the way his fingers curved, the way he breathed before difficult runs. He wasn't looking for mistakes, he was learning, soaking in every detail like a dry sponge meeting water. By the end of the pianist's set, the applause was still strong, but it carried a different tone than it had at the start of the night. There was appreciation, yes, but also something quieter. Like people had seen behind the curtain and realized there was more to music than fame and skill. When the lights brightened for intermission, people stood and moved toward the lobby. The air buzzed with conversation. Some talked about the pianist's brilliance, but many spoke of the boy, Did you see his hands? One man said they moved like the keys were part of him. A woman replied. He made me cry, and I don't even know why. The boy stayed in his seat, not because he didn't want to move, but because he was still inside the music, his thoughts drifting between the songs he had played and the way the piano had felt under his fingers. It was as if every note had left a trace on his skin from the stage. The pianist glanced at him once more before stepping into the wings. For a brief second, their eyes met. It wasn't a challenge this time. It was something else, maybe curiosity, maybe respect, or maybe the start of something neither of them could name. Around the boy, the once formal audience now felt like a community, strangers leaning toward each other, sharing the moment they had just experienced. The room had transformed from a place of status and show into something warmer, more human. The boy didn't realize it yet, but this shift would follow him beyond the concert hall. People would remember not just the notes he played, but the way he changed the air in the room, the way he took a place he wasn't supposed to belong and made it his own. The night was far from over, but already. The boy had turned a single chance into something much bigger. The transformation of the room was only the first ripple in a wave that was about to grow far stronger. The standing ovation, the second half of the concert, moved forward. The famous pianist playing with his usual mastery, his fingers gliding over the keys with a speed and precision that left no doubt about his skill. The audience clapped after each piece, but the energy in the room was no longer the same. The earlier spark, the one the boy had lit, still lingered in the air. During one quiet moment between songs, the host returned to the stage, microphone in hand, his voice carrying a playful warmth. Before we close tonight, I think we should hear one more thing, he said. The crowd shifted, curious. Our young guest earlier gave us something we'll all remember, so how about one more from him? The audience reacted instantly, clapping, cheering, even whistling. A few stood halfway out of their seats as if to make the decision for the pianist. The boy froze in his chair, eyes wide. He hadn't expected to be called again. His pulse quickened. Part of him wanted to shake his head, but the sound of the crowd made it impossible to say no. The pianist gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. All right, he said into the microphone. Let's see if our friend here can surprise us again. His voice was smooth, but there was a weight in it this time, something more serious. The boy stood slowly, the warmth of the lights washing over him again as he made his way up the aisle. People reached out to pat his shoulder as he passed. Whispering words of encouragement, he stepped back onto the stage. The wood beneath his shoes creaking softly, he sat at the bench, his hands hovering over the keys. The hall grew completely silent. Even the soft rustle of programs stopped. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but instead of fear, he felt a calm determination. This was no longer about proving himself. This was about giving the room something it would never forget, his. Fingers began to move, the first notes light and playful, a melody that danced through the air like sunlight on water. The audience smiled, drawn in instantly. The sound filled the space without force, but with an ease that was almost magnetic. As the music built, it took on a new tone, stronger, deeper, richer. The boy's hands moved with purpose, telling a story without words, each note carrying a piece of his heart, his struggles, his joy, his longing. The piano became not just an instrument, but an extension of himself. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn closer as if the music itself had reached out and taken their hands. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes. A man in the balcony closed his eyes and breathed in slowly. The hall was no longer just a room. It was a living, breathing thing, wrapped in sound. The pianist stood just behind him, watching closely, his gaze no longer dismissive. His head tilted slightly, as if studying the way the boy's fingers moved. There was no hint of a smirk now, only quiet focus. The boy reached the height of the piece, his hands moving faster and faster. Yet each note was clear, sharp, and full of life. The sound seemed to rise above the audience, filling the high ceiling, pressing gently against the walls. It was as if the music was too big to stay in the room. Then came the fall, the gradual softening of the melody, like the sun setting after a long day. His fingers slowed, the notes becoming warmer, each one lingering just long enough to be felt, not just heard. The air in the hall grew still. The audience holding its breath, the final note rang out. Pure and steady, fading into silence. The boy kept his hands on the keys for a moment before lowering them to his lap. He did not look up right away, letting the quiet settle over the crowd. And then it happened. The first clap came from somewhere near the center. Quick and sharp, followed by another and another. In seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. The sound exploding into a wave of applause. People cheered, whistled, some even shouted his name, though they didn't know it. The boy stood slowly, looking around in disbelief. He had never imagined this hundreds of people standing, their faces lit with admiration and joy, clapping just for him. The warmth of it washed over him, leaving his chest tight and his eyes stinging. The pianist clapped too, his hands moving. Slowly but deliberately, his eyes meeting the boy's with something close to respect. The host grinned wide. Stepping forward to raise the boy's arm like a champion in a ring, the audience roared louder at the gesture. The ovation went on and on, longer than any the boy had ever heard. Long enough that he didn't know how to respond except to bow, awkwardly, his hair falling into his face, then straighten with a shy smile. For the rest of his life, he would remember that moment, not for the noise, not for the lights, but for the feeling deep in his heart, the certainty that no matter where he came from, no matter how people judged him at first glance, he could stand on any stage and belong. The standing ovation was not just for the music he had played. It was for the journey they had all felt in it, for the courage it took to walk toward a challenge instead of away from it, for the beauty of something true in a world full of pretense. As he stepped off the stage, the sound of the applause still ringing behind him, the boy knew this was only the beginning, the truth about the boy when the ovation finally faded. The boy returned to his seat, his steps slow, not because he was tired, but because he was still caught in the glow of what had just happened. The warmth from the crowd seemed to cling to him like sunlight after a long winter. Around him, people continued to whisper, some turning in their seats to get a better look at him, others smiling at him like they already knew his story, but they didn't. No one here knew who he really was or where he had come from. They only knew what they had just heard and the way it had made them feel. The host, still on stage, spoke. With a softer tone now, "You might be wondering who our young guest is," he said, the microphone catching every gentle word. The audience grew quiet again, leaning in. "Well, so are we." His words earned a small laugh, but it was warm, filled with curiosity rather than mockery. The boy lowered his gaze, sure if he wanted to be the center of attention for anything other than his playing, but something inside told him it was time. People deserved to know, not because it would add to his music, but because it might help them understand why it mattered so much to him. After the concert ended, small groups of guests began to gather in the lobby, talking over glasses of wine and coffee. The boy stayed near the side, leaning against the wall, watching as people mingled under the soft golden lights. A middle-aged man in a dark coat approached him. "That was incredible," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy hesitated, then answered honestly, "I didn't." Not in the way most people do. He told the man that he had never been to a music school, never had a formal lesson, that most of what he knew came from standing outside a music shop in his neighborhood, watching through the dusty glass as the owner played old records and sometimes practiced on a piano in the corner. When the shop was closed, the boy would sneak into his uncle's garage, where an old, broken upright piano sat in the corner. The keys were chipped, some didn't work, and the sound was uneven, but it was enough for him. He practiced until his fingers hurt, till the air in the garage was cold enough to make him see his breath. The man listened closely, nodding slowly. "So, you taught yourself?" he asked. The boy gave a small shrug. "I guess," he said quietly. "I just kept playing until it sounded right." Word of his story spread quickly among the guests. Soon more people came to speak with him, not just to compliment his playing, but to ask questions. "How long have you been playing? Do you write your own music? What inspires you?" He answered each one simply, without drama. But his honesty only made people more drawn to him. The pianist, who had remained in the main hall for a while after the show. Eventually stepped into the lobby. He moved with the same grace as before. But there was a slight difference in his expression. Less polished, more thoughtful. His eyes found the boy across the room, and he made his way over. When he stood in front of him, there was a pause. The kind that holds more weight than words. Then, with a steady voice, he said, "I underestimated you." His tone was even, not overly warm, but there was no arrogance in it either. "You have something that can't be taught." The boy met his gaze, unsure what to say. Finally, he replied, "I just play what I feel." The pianist gave a small nod. "That's exactly why they stood for you," he said, then turned and walked toward the door, leaving the boy with those words later. As the crowd thinned and people began to leave, the boy stepped outside. The night air cool against his skin, the street was quiet now, the glow of the hall behind him casting soft light on the sidewalk. He took a deep breath, letting the memories of the night settle in his chest. He realized that the truth about him wasn't that he had no training, or that he came from nowhere special. The truth was that he loved music so deeply it had become part of who he was. That love had reached people in a way skill alone never could. It didn't matter that he wasn't famous. It didn't matter that he didn't have the best piano or the finest teacher. Tonight had proven that music wasn't about status, it was about connection. About making people feel something real. As he walked away from the hall, the echoes of the applause still in his mind. He knew that his journey was only beginning. The world might not know his name yet, but they would remember the boy who played. Like he belonged on any stage, and for him, that was enough, at least for now. The pianist's lesson in the concert hall was almost empty now. The last of the guests stepping out into the night, their laughter and conversation drifting away with the sound of closing doors. Inside, the lights above the stage had dimmed, leaving the grand piano sitting alone in a soft glow. The famous pianist remained near the side of the stage, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood. For years he had performed in the greatest halls, under the brightest lights, praised by critics and loved by audiences. Yet something about tonight had unsettled him, not in a way that hurt his pride, but in a way that made him think. He thought back to when he had first started playing as a boy. Back then, music had been pure joy. It had been about the sound, the feeling, the way his heart raced when a melody came together, somewhere along the way. As the awards and the tours piled up, he had lost some of that. His playing was still flawless, but it no longer carried the same fire. Watching the boy earlier, he had felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not competition, but a kind of reminder, a voice whispering, "This is what it's supposed to feel like." He remembered the first notes the boy had played, hesitant but honest, growing into something powerful. It's not because of perfect technique, but because every note meant something. It wasn't polished in the same way as a trained performer, but it was alive, breathing, reaching into the hearts of the people listening. The pianist sat down on the bench, his fingers resting on the keys. He began to play softly. Not for an audience, not for applause, but for himself. The notes came. Slowly at first, then with more certainty, he let himself make mistakes. Let the music wander where it wanted. There was a warmth in it he hadn't felt in a long time. Meanwhile, outside, the boy had not gone far. He stood by the edge of the street, watching the hall through the tall glass windows. He could see the pianist still at the piano, his posture different now, looser, less formal. The boy stayed there. For a moment, listening faintly through the glass. The sound that reached him was softer than what the pianist had played earlier. But it felt more human, more real, and though the boy didn't know it, he had sparked this change. A stagehand came, out to lock the side doors, and paused when he saw the boy. "He's still in there, isn't he?" the man asked with a small smile. "That's rare. Usually he's the first to leave after a show." The boy just nodded, unsure how to explain what he was feeling. Back inside, the pianist finished the quiet piece, his hands resting on the keys for a moment. He looked toward the empty seats, remembering the standing ovation. Not for himself, but for the boy. And instead of feeling threatened, he felt grateful. It had reminded him that greatness wasn't about being above others. It was about touching. Then he stood, his reflection catching in the black surface of the piano, and thought about the way he had spoken to the boy at first. The casual insult meant to get a laugh. He felt a small sting of regret. Not because the boy had proven him wrong, but because he had forgotten what it meant to believe in someone before judging them. The next morning, a quiet buzz began to spread through the city's music circles. People talked about the young boy at the concert, about how he had played like a master without any formal training, about how the famous pianist had stood clapping for him. When a reporter asked the pianist later about the moment, he didn't hesitate sometimes, he said. A performance comes along that reminds you why you started in the first place. That boy gave me that reminder. His words were printed in the next day's papers, alongside a photo of the boy at the piano, his head bent over the keys. The boy didn't see himself as a sensation. He went back to his simple life, practicing whenever he could, playing because it filled something in his heart. But he carried the memory of that night like a quiet light, one he could always return to. As for the pianist, his next performances felt different. The audiences noticed, critics noticed too. There was something warmer in his music now, a depth that came not from perfect technique, but from letting himself feel again. He had the same skill as always, but now it carried the weight of truth. Months later, at another concert in another city, the pianist looked out at the crowd and saw a familiar figure in the back row, the boy wearing the same oversized jacket. He smiled, a genuine smile this time. And after the show, he found him. "I owe you something," the pianist said quietly, "not for playing well, but for reminding me who I am." The boy shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." But the pianist disagreed. "No, I do," he said. "And one day, I hope you'll stand on this stage again, only this time as the main act." The boy didn't promise, didn't say yes or no, but the idea stayed with him as they parted.
Oh.
The pianist realized that perhaps the greatest standing ovation of his career wasn't for him at all. It was the one he had witnessed from the side of the stage. For a boy who had walked in a stranger and left a musician, and that, he thought, was the best lesson he had learned in years.